"He's only a butler," the princess told the warlord, before he disarmed the whole room. The smell of polished silver was the first thing that mattered that evening. A clean, cold, metallic scent that meant the good service had come out of storage, which meant the night was important, which meant Marcus Wren had spent the last 4 hours making sure every fork on that table sat exactly 1 centimeter from the plate's edge. Because precision was the only thing left in his life he still had complete control over. Somewhere below the estate's east wing, a string quartet was tuning, the faint discordant scrape of instruments finding their pitch drifting up through the old stone floors. Somewhere above it, storm clouds were building over the Korathi capital in slow, gray columns that promised rain before midnight. And somewhere in between, in the grand dining hall of House Ithian, a war was about to walk through the front door wearing a diplomat's smile. He set the last wine glass in place, straightened, and checked his reflection in the polished tureen out of old habit rather than vanity, gray at the temples now, more than there'd been 5 years ago, a face that had learned to hold still no matter what was happening behind it. His uniform was pressed to a knife's edge, black with the pale Ithian blue piping that marked him as senior household staff. And if you looked closely, which nobody ever did, you'd have noticed his knuckles were a landscape of old scar tissue that had nothing to do with decades of polishing silverware, and that his stance, even standing still checking crystal, carried the particular unconscious readiness of a man who had once been paid to notice every exit in a room before he noticed anything else in it. He was 52 years old, and for the last 6 years he had been, officially, a butler. Before that, for the 22 years prior, he had been other things, things that didn't appear on the employment record House Ithian had on file, things that had ended the day a mission in the Varanai border conflict had gone wrong in a way that got 11 soldiers killed and Marcus quietly discharged, not for incompetence, but because the report he'd filed afterward had named a general's son as the reason the mission failed. And generals' sons did not get blamed for things in any army Marcus had ever served in. He'd taken the only work that would have him after that, work nobody asked hard questions about, work that mostly involved silver trays and the kind of invisibility that came from being beneath anyone's notice. He remembered the exit interview, if you could call it that, a colonel he'd respected once, unable to meet his eyes, sliding a severance packet across a desk, and saying only that some truths cost more than the army was willing to pay, and that Marcus should consider himself lucky it hadn't cost him a court-martial instead. That suited him fine most days. Being beneath notice was, in its own quiet way, exactly the skill set he'd spent a career building, first out of necessity and then, eventually, out of something closer to relief. There had been a period in the first year after his discharge when he drifted between temporary postings on 3 different worlds, taking jobs that lasted weeks rather than months, never quite settling because settling meant someone might ask questions about the gaps in his record. House Ithian had been the first place that hadn't asked. The old Grand Duchess, Ussa's mother, a formidable woman named Ilith Ithian who had run her household with the same iron discipline she'd run her territory, had interviewed him personally, looked at the careful gaps in his file, and said only, "I don't need to know what you were. I need to know you can keep a household running without drama, and that you'll tell me the truth about my own security even when I don't want to hear it." Marcus had done both, faithfully, for the 6 years since, and had buried whatever he used to be so deep beneath the routine of the job that most days he genuinely forgot it was still down there. Grand Duchess Ussa Ithian found him in the pantry an hour before the guests arrived, checking the last of the crystal against the light for water spots. She was young for her rank, barely into her 3rd decade, having inherited the house's leadership 18 months earlier when her mother's heart had finally given out under the weight of holding a border territory together against pressures that had only gotten worse since. She was tall even by Korathi standards, pale gold skin catching the pantry's low light, dressed already in the severe formal where her advisors had insisted on for tonight. Every inch the picture of a leader who had aged a decade in the 18 months since she'd needed to become one, though Marcus still occasionally caught glimpses, in unguarded moments like this one, of the frightened 23-year-old who'd inherited a crown she'd never expected to wear so soon. Standing at her mother's memorial service, trying not to let the assembled dignitaries see her hands shake. "You're worried," Marcus said, not looking up from the glass in his hands. "Warlord Vosk does not travel this far south for a courtesy dinner, Marcus. He travels for annexation, or for marriage, and I suspect tonight he intends to offer me both as though they were the same generous gift." She sat on an overturned crate, an unroyal habit she'd never quite broken since childhood, one Marcus had stopped commenting on years ago because he privately thought it was one of the few honest things left in her schedule. "My advisors want extra guards in the hall." I told them no. A show of force insults him before he's said a word, and he'll use the insult as justification for whatever he was already planning to do. "You're probably right." Marcus set the glass down, finally looking at her. "For what it's worth, you'll have me in the room regardless. Pouring wine's not exactly a fortification, but it's something." Ussa almost smiled at that, the first almost smile he'd seen from her all week. "You worry about me more than my actual security detail does, you know." "Your actual security detail's paid to worry about you in a specific, official capacity," Marcus said, going back to the glass. "I just worry about you because I've watched you grow into this job since you were 23 and scared out of your mind, and I'd rather you didn't get annexed on my watch. Bad for the silver polishing schedule." "Is that truly all it is? Bad scheduling?" Marcus paused, setting the glass down with more care than it strictly required. "No," he admitted. "It's not all it is. But it's the part I'm comfortable saying out loud tonight, so let's leave it there and get through the evening first." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded, accepting the boundary the way she'd learned to accept most of his boundaries over 6 years, without pushing, but without pretending they weren't there either. "My mother trusted you," she said, quieter now. "She never told me why exactly. Just that you were the one person in this house whose advice she never once regretted taking, even when she didn't like hearing it." "Your mother was a sharp judge of people," Marcus said. "Wish she'd been wrong about me. Would have made tonight considerably less complicated if I really were just a butler." "2 hours," Ussa said, rising from the crate and smoothing her formal wear, letting the moment pass because there wasn't time left to linger in it. "Try not to let the wine service betray how nervous I actually am." "Never have yet," Marcus said and meant it. He had a few minutes alone after that, before the staff assembled for final briefing, and he spent them the way he always spent the quiet minutes before a difficult service, running the room in his head. 6 exits, counting the service corridor and the 2 windows large enough for an adult to pass through in an emergency. Load-bearing points in the old stone architecture that would matter if things ever got physical, which he told himself, every time, they never would, and which had never once actually been true on the handful of occasions House Ithian's hospitality had gone sideways over the years. A drunk trade minister once, a jealous cousin with a grudge another time, nothing that had ever required more than a firm hand and a quiet word. Tonight didn't feel like nothing. Tonight felt, in the particular way Marcus had learned to trust from 22 years of paying attention to feelings like this one, like something that was going to require more than a firm hand and a quiet word before it was through. He checked the sideboard one more time, the heavy silver serving tray, the candelabra, the arrangement of utensils at each place setting. Not because any of it needed checking again, but because his hands wanted something to do while the rest of him ran calculations he wasn't ready to admit he was running. Warlord Dreith Vosk arrived precisely on time, which itself was a kind of statement. A man that powerful didn't need to be punctual, and the fact that he was anyway meant every second of this evening had been planned down to its smallest gesture. He stood nearly 2.5 meters, built like something designed rather than born, dense corded muscle beneath armor plating worn even to a diplomatic dinner. A silent reminder to everyone in the room of exactly what kind of leverage he was bringing to the table. His face was all hard angles and old scars worn like decorations, and when he entered House Ithian's grand hall flanked by 6 armed retainers, the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees before he'd said a single word. "Grand Duchess," he said, inclining his head the exact minimum required by protocol and not 1 degree further, "you honor me with this hospitality." "Warlord Vosk, please sit. Dinner will be served shortly." His gaze swept the room as he moved. To his seat, the string quartet, the arranged flowers, the careful absence of visible security, and finally landed, briefly, dismissively, on Marcus standing at his station near the sideboard with a wine bottle held ready. "Your household staff," Vosk observed, not quite a question. "My butler. Marcus has served this house for 6 years." Ussa's tone was carefully neutral, the tone of someone determined not to give an inch of unnecessary information to a man who would use every scrap of it. "He'll be pouring tonight." Vosk's attention slid off Marcus entirely, the way attention slides off furniture, and settled back on Ussa with the focused weight of a predator who had already decided nothing else in the room mattered. "Then, let us not waste the evening on formalities neither of us believes in, Grand Duchess. I have come to discuss the future of your border territories, and I believe you already know the shape that future is going to take." The first course passed in careful, guarded small talk, the weather over the eastern passes, a mutual acquaintance's recent retirement, the quality of the wine Marcus poured with steady, unhurried hands despite every instinct in his body already cataloging the 6 retainers' positions relative to the exits, relative to Ussa, relative to each other. He'd done this kind of math before, a long time ago, in rooms that looked nothing like this one, and served nothing so fine as vintage Korathi red. The habit hadn't left him just because the uniform had changed. Vosk's retainers, he noted, were positioned with a precision that spoke of real training, 2 by the main doors, 2 flanking the warlord's own chair, 2 more spaced along the far wall with clean sightlines to every seated diplomat. Whoever had drilled this escort had drilled them well. That fact alone told Marcus more about tonight's real intentions than anything said aloud over the soup course. The inciting moment came over the second course, when Vosk set down his utensils with a deliberate click that silenced the quartet mid-phrase, and delivered, in a voice that carried the flat certainty of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed, the terms he'd traveled here to deliver. "House Ithian will be annexed into my territory by the season's end," he said. "This is not a negotiation, Grand Duchess, whatever the invitation implied. It is a courtesy, extended because your mother once did me a service I have not forgotten. You have 2 paths remaining to you. You may marry into my household as consort, retaining a ceremonial title in your life, while your territory and its resources come under my direct administration. Or you may refuse, in which case my forces, already positioned along your eastern border, closer than your own intelligence has told you, will take the territory regardless, and I will not trouble myself to offer you a ceremonial title afterward." The room had gone utterly still. Us's advisors, seated further down the table, had frozen mid-motion, several hands drifting toward weapons they knew better than to draw in a room with 6 of Vosk's own armed retainers standing at the walls. "That is not a choice," Ussa said, her voice steady despite everything. "That is an ultimatum dressed as hospitality." "It is both," Vosk said. "I find the distinction rarely matters to the outcome." He gestured almost lazily, and his 6 retainers moved in unison, weapons rising from their positions along the wall, not yet aimed but no longer concealed either, a silent demonstration of exactly how quickly this room could change from dinner party to massacre. "I would prefer this end in a marriage contract, Grand Duchess. I am not a man who enjoys unnecessary waste. But I will have this territory tonight, in one form or another, and I would ask you to consider very carefully which form costs fewer lives before you answer." There was no way to opt out of that math. A refusal meant the room went from tense to violent within seconds, with a security detail Ussa had deliberately kept minimal, in a hall with no reinforcements close enough to matter before 6 armed retainers finished whatever Vosk ordered them to start. "He's only a butler," Ussa said suddenly, and for one disorienting second Marcus thought she'd lost the thread of the conversation entirely, until he understood, watching her eyes flick once briefly, toward him and away, that she was doing the only thing left in her power to do, trying to make him invisible again, to keep Vosk's retainers from registering him as anything worth watching in the seconds before this room came apart. "Warlord Vosk, whatever you decide here tonight, my staff have no part in it. Let him leave the hall." Vosk didn't even bother looking at Marcus this time. "The butler is irrelevant to these proceedings," he agreed. "He may go or stay as he wishes. It changes nothing." Marcus, wine bottle still in hand, did not move toward the door. The first beat of it began, and before anyone in the room fully understood it had started. Marcus set the wine bottle down on the sideboard with unhurried precision, and in the same motion, without any wasted movement at all, flipped the heavy silver serving tray from beneath it into a spinning arc that caught the nearest retainer. A guard positioned 6 feet to Vosk's left, directly across the wrist holding his weapon, hard enough to send the sidearm skittering across the polished floor before the man had even registered the tray leaving Marcus's hand. "What is this?" Vosk said, more surprised than alarmed, watching his retainer clutch a wrist that had very possibly just been broken. "Household accident," Marcus said, already moving, closing the distance to the second retainer before the first had finished crying out. "Happens more than you'd think, working around this much silverware." The second guard got a shot off wild, high, punching through a decorative tapestry 6 feet above anyone's head, before Marcus closed the last 2 feet and drove the heel of his palm up into the man's jaw with the same clean, economical motion of a man who had spent 22 years being paid to know exactly where that particular strike landed hardest. The guard went down in a heap, weapon clattering free. 2 retainers disabled in under 8 seconds. 4 left, all of them now fully alert, weapons swinging toward a man they had, 90 seconds earlier, dismissed as furniture. Us's advisors, still frozen at the table, watched with expressions caught somewhere between horror and dawning, disbelieving hope, none of them yet able to process what they were actually seeing. One of them, an older diplomat named Corvin who had served 3 Grand Duchesses across 2 decades, would later swear he'd seen this exact fighting style once before, decades ago, in a very different context, and would spend weeks afterward quietly trying to place where. Beat 2 cost him. The third and fourth retainers moved together, flanking, and Marcus took a glancing shot across the outer thigh that dropped him briefly to one knee, heat and pain blooming instant and sharp. Before he rolled clear behind an overturned dining chair that bought him half a second, he used to snatch a heavy candelabra off the sideboard he'd passed, molten wax and all, and fling it underhand into the nearer guard's face, buying enough chaos to close the gap and disarm the man's weapon with a wrist lock that ended, with an audible crack, the guard's ability to hold anything in that hand for a good while. "You are bleeding," Vosk observed, still seated, watching the unfolding chaos with the detached curiosity of a man reviewing an unexpected but not unwelcome variable in an equation he still believed he controlled. "You are also, I begin to suspect, not merely a butler." "Wine stains worse than blood," Marcus said, breathing hard now, dragging himself upright off the leg that had taken the shot. "Learned that the hard way about 4 years into this job. Ask me again in a minute, I might have a better answer for you." Beat 3 brought the last 2 conscious retainers in fast, coordinated, clearly the more experienced of Vosk's escort, and Marcus, leg bleeding freely now through his black uniform trousers, one hand throbbing from the wrist lock's recoil, took a solid blow across the ribs that folded him half over and cost him the breath he needed to keep moving cleanly. He used the fold, rather than fighting it, letting his body's forward collapse become momentum, driving his shoulder up and into the nearer guard's midsection hard enough to slam the man back into the sideboard with enough force to crack the wood paneling behind it. The last guard, weapon finally leveled and steady, had a clean shot at Marcus's exposed back for a full second that felt, to everyone watching, considerably longer than a second actually was. Ussa moved first, not toward safety, but toward the guard, seizing a serving fork off the table in front of her and driving it hard into the back of the man's gun hand, enough to throw his aim wide as the shot fired, scorching a black line across the tablecloth instead of through Marcus's spine. "Grand Duchess," Marcus said, straightening with a wince. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've watched all week, and I include my own choices in that comparison." "I decided it was time to stop being furniture too," Ussa said, breathing hard, still holding the fork like a weapon, because in the moment it very much had been one. Beat 4 was the one that finally cost Marcus something he couldn't shrug off. The last standing retainer, disarmed but far from finished, drove a shoulder into Marcus's already injured ribs and bore him backward into the sideboard hard enough to crack 2 ribs cleanly through, white-hot pain flooding his whole side. And for one long, ugly moment Marcus's vision narrowed to a tunnel, while the guard's hands closed around his throat with a grip. Clearly meant to finish this decisively. He didn't have air to fight the grip directly. He didn't try to. He let his knees buckle, dropping his own weight suddenly and unexpectedly, breaking the guard's leverage just enough to drive his good elbow up and back into the man's exposed throat with everything his failing air supply had left to give. The guard went down and didn't get back up. 6 retainers, disabled in under 90 seconds, by a household staff member, every single one of them had walked into that room already certain didn't matter. Marcus sagged against the sideboard, one hand pressed to ribs that were very clearly broken, the other still smeared with candle wax and someone else's blood, breathing in short, careful pulls that told him exactly how bad the damage really was. He didn't say anything heroic. He looked at Vosk, still seated, still unmoved from his chair through the entire exchange, and said, "Dessert's going to be a few minutes late. My apologies." Vosk did not reach for a weapon of his own. He sat very still for a long moment, studying the wreckage of his own security detail scattered across a dining hall that had, 90 seconds earlier, been a scene of quiet diplomatic tension, and something moved behind his hard, scarred features that Marcus recognized. from 2 decades spent reading the exact same expression on soldiers twice this man's size, as genuine recalculation. "You are not a butler," Vosk said again, this time with none of the earlier lazy dismissal in it at all. "I am actually," Marcus said, still pressing a hand to his ribs. "6 years running, good references I intend to keep if you don't mind. Before that I was other things. Doesn't much matter what, not to tonight's conversation." "It matters a great deal to tonight's conversation," Vosk said. "I brought 6 of my finest personal retainers into this hall, men who have served me through 3 border campaigns, and you disabled all 6 with a serving tray, a candelabra, and a dinner fork wielded, I note, not even by yourself." His gaze flicked briefly to Ussa, still gripping the fork with white knuckles. "I had read reports on human physiology before accepting this dinner invitation, Grand Duchess. Fragile, slow to mature. Physically unremarkable compared to nearly every species in this quadrant. I did not think to update those reports for the possibility that your household staff might individually outperform an elite military escort." "Most of my household staff can't," Marcus said. "I'd stick to hiring the ones who genuinely just want to polish your silver if I were you. Cheaper insurance premiums." One of Vosk's downed retainers, the first to have taken the tray across the wrist, groaned from where he lay near the wall, and Ussa's own household guard finally moved, having apparently decided in the last 90 seconds that the situation had changed enough to warrant intervention after all, filing in from the side corridor to secure the disarmed men with a caution that suggested they weren't entirely sure whether Marcus counted as a threat that needed containing too. "Stand down," Ussa told them, still short of breath. "He's with me. He's always been with me. I simply didn't realize how thoroughly until tonight." The turning point came without further words for a long moment. Vosk simply rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, and for one tense second every advisor still frozen at the table clearly expected the confrontation to resume on new terms. Instead, the warlord crossed to where his unconscious lead retainer lay sprawled near the sideboard, knelt, and retrieved the man's fallen sidearm. And then, in full view of the room, reversed it in his grip, and offered it to Marcus, hilt first, in the universal gesture of a soldier surrendering a weapon to someone he had just been forced to recognize as an equal, or better. "I do not offer this lightly," Vosk said. "Among my people, a warrior who yields his weapon to another acknowledges a debt of honor that does not clear easily. You did not kill a single one of my retainers, though you had ample cause and ample opportunity too. You disabled them precisely, with exactly the force required and no more. That is not the fighting style of a desperate man. That is the fighting style of someone who has made a very deliberate choice about what kind of violence he is willing to commit, even when cornered." Marcus looked at the offered weapon for a long moment, then shook his head slowly, wincing at the movement in his ribs. "Keep it. I don't carry those anymore on principle, and I'm not looking to start a collection tonight. But I'll take the acknowledgement if that's what you're offering. Beats getting shot." Vosk lowered the weapon, something that might have been the beginning of respect settling into his hard features. "Then let us speak plainly, without the theater my arrival demanded of both of us. Grand Duchess, I extend my apologies for the man. Of tonight's proposal, it was not well made." "Apology noted," Ussa said. "Though I suspect we're not finished with tonight's difficulties yet, Warlord. You mentioned your forces were positioned along my eastern border. I'd like to understand exactly how positioned, before we go any further with pleasantries." Vosk's expression darkened, some new calculation replacing the last. "A fair question, and one I confess I would rather not answer honestly, though I intend to regardless. My forces are positioned closer to your border than I told you at dinner, Grand Duchess. Close enough that a single miscommunication could see them moving within the hour, regardless of anything decided in this room tonight. The physician arrived while that conversation was still unfolding, summoned by one of USA's household guards, who'd had the presence of mind to send for help the moment the fighting stopped, and set immediately to work on Marcus's ribs with the brisk efficiency of someone who had clearly patched up worse in her years serving House Ithian. She was an older woman named Sella, gray-haired and unhurried despite the chaos still settling around her, and she worked in near silence, only occasionally muttering disapproval at the state of the wound on his thigh. "You've done this before," she observed, wrapping a compression bandage tight around his ribs with hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply. "Once or twice," Marcus admitted, gritting his teeth against the wrap. "Long time ago." "The scarring on your side isn't from tonight," she said, not quite a question, cutting the bandage's end and tucking it neatly. "Old wounds, several of them. I've dressed a lot of household injuries in my years here, Marcus. Never once seen scarring like this on anyone who spent their career pouring wine." "Small mercies. You've never asked me about it before," Marcus said. "Would have had to lie to you, and I try not to lie to the person holding a needle near my ribs." Sella huffed something that might have been amusement and moved on to the leg wound without further comment, though Marcus caught her glancing once, thoughtfully, at the 6 unconscious retainers still being tended by their own physician on the far side of the hall, before she went back to her work. The second complication surfaced within the hour, once the wounded retainers had been carried out under USA's own medical staff's care, and the dining hall's shattered furniture had been cleared enough to allow conversation to continue with something like normalcy restored. A courier arrived, breathless, bearing word from House Ithian's eastern border outpost that made the evening's earlier crisis look, in retrospect, almost survivable by comparison. Vosk's own forces, positioned along that border exactly as he'd claimed, had begun moving without his authorization the moment word reached them, through channels nobody could yet explain, that their warlord's dinner negotiation had turned violent. "A faction within my own command structure," Vosk said grimly, reading the courier's dispatch with a stillness that had gone entirely cold. "There are officers beneath me who believe annexation should come through conquest rather than negotiation, who have opposed my preference for a marriage settlement from the start. If they believe tonight's violence means I have been captured or killed, they will not wait for my confirmation before advancing. They will simply attack and blame the chaos on House Ithian's treachery afterward, regardless of what actually happened in this hall." "How long?" Usa asked, already moving toward her own command staff. 2 hours, perhaps less. My forward units are positioned to breach your border defenses within the hour if given the order, and I have no reliable way to countermand that order from here. The same faction that would give it controls the relay stations along that stretch of border, a redundancy I built in myself, years ago, against the possibility of exactly this kind of internal rebellion, and which I now deeply regret constructing so effectively." Vosk's jaw tightened. "I cannot stop what I built to be unstoppable from outside, my own chain of command." Marcus, still seated with the physician finishing the last of the bandaging, looked up at that. "What kind of relay system are we talking about? Signal-based or something more physical?" "Signal relay towers, encrypted, keyed to authorization codes only my senior command staff possess," Vosk said. "Why does this interest you?" "Because if it's signal-based, it's got a failure mode somewhere, same as every system built by people in a hurry to make something unstoppable," Marcus said, wincing as he sat up straighter despite the physician's protest. "Nothing's actually unstoppable. It's just inconvenient to stop, which isn't the same thing at all. You understand relay architecture. Vosk's chief engineer, a nervous, sharp-eyed officer named Thren Kal who had accompanied the Warlord's party and stood near the doorway looking distinctly out of her depth, spoke up for the first time all evening. That is specialist military knowledge, sir. Even among my own field, few outside command engineering ever touch that protocol layer. I used to be other things before I was a butler, Marcus said, by way of explanation that satisfied no one and answered exactly enough of the question to move things forward. Walk me through the architecture. We've got maybe 2 hours to matter, and I'd rather spend the first 10 minutes of it understanding the problem than guessing at a fix I can't verify. Thren Kal glanced at Vosk, who nodded once, and crossed the room to pull up a schematic display from a portable terminal she'd been carrying since her arrival, the wariness in her posture slowly giving way to the focused urgency of someone who had just been handed a problem too large to solve alone and was relieved, despite herself, to have an extra set of hands offered toward it. The climax, when it came, wasn't a fight at all. Marcus spent the next hour in House Ithian's own communications wing, ribs taped tight enough to let him breathe without wanting to scream, working alongside Thren Kal, who had gone, in the space of that hour, from visibly skeptical to leaning over the schematic display, with the focused intensity of someone who'd stopped questioning her strange new colleague's credentials and started simply keeping up with him, tracing the architecture of Vosk's border relay network until he found exactly the vulnerability he'd suspected from the start. Your relay towers run on a shared authentication protocol, right? All keyed to the same command hierarchy, Marcus said, studying the schematic Thren Kal had pulled up. Which means if the officers who have gone rogue are issuing orders through that same protocol, they're not bypassing your authority, they're borrowing it. That's actually good news. It means the system still trusts the Warlord's authorization more than it trusts theirs. If we can get a genuine override command into the network faster, then they can push their advance order through. The relay towers require a hardline connection for command-level overrides, Thren Kal said. We cannot transmit one remotely. Someone would need to physically reach the primary relay tower and interface directly, and that tower sits well inside the contested border zone, exactly where the advancing units are currently massing. Then somebody needs to get there fast, with the Warlord's actual authorization codes, and push the override before those units cross the line, Marcus said. Question is whether we've got a transport that can make it there ahead of a 2-hour deadline that might already be shrinking. House Ithian maintains a fast courier shuttle, Ussa said, already moving toward the door. I'll authorize it personally. But Marcus, she stopped, looking back at him at the taped ribs and the blood still drying on his uniform sleeve, you're in no condition to make that flight. I'm not planning to fly it, Marcus said. I'm planning to make sure whoever does knows exactly which override sequence to push and in what order, because Thren Kal's going to need someone who can talk her through the interface fast under pressure without getting it wrong the first time. That I can do sitting down. Get her in the air. We've got maybe 90 minutes left to matter. Thren Kal hesitated at the doorway, looking back at Marcus with an expression caught between fear and something newer, something that hadn't been there an hour earlier. You trust me to do this? I watched you catch a keying error in that schematic 4 minutes before I did, Marcus said. Yeah, I trust you. Now get in the air before I have to explain to your warlord why we ran out of time arguing about it. She left at a run. Vosk watched her go with an expression Marcus couldn't fully read, somewhere between pride and worry, before turning back to the room. She is young for this kind of responsibility, Vosk said quietly. I did not choose her for tonight's escort because I thought I would need an engineer. I chose her because she is competent and because I trust her discretion. I did not intend to send her alone into a contested border zone with the fate of my entire command structure resting on her hands. Nobody ever intends the moment that ends up mattering most, Marcus said. You just have to make sure the person you're sending is better prepared than they think they are, and then you get out of their way and let them prove it. She'll manage. I wouldn't have sent her if I thought otherwise. The flight out was tense in a way none of the room's earlier violence had quite matched, precisely because Marcus could do nothing about it but talk. His voice steady and unhurried over a comm link that crackled with interference for most of the journey, walking Thren Cal through the override protocol's layered authentication sequence one careful step at a time, while Vosk paced the length of the communications wing behind him, unable to sit still for the first time all evening. Your third code cluster, Marcus said, watching the telemetry crawl across the display. Don't push it yet. Confirm the tower's still broadcasting on the primary frequency first. If it's already switched to a rebel override, we need a different entry point, and pushing the wrong sequence into a compromised tower could lock the whole authentication chain for hours we don't have. Confirmed primary frequency active, Thren Cal's voice came back, tight with concentration. 20 minutes out from the tower. The advancing units are visible on approach radar. They haven't crossed the marker line yet. Good, keep that pace. We want to arrive with minutes to spare, not seconds. Seconds is how people push the wrong button. Vosk stopped pacing long enough to look at Marcus directly. You are remarkably calm for a man whose plan depends entirely on a young engineer executing a sequence she has never practiced, under fire, against a deadline that may already be too tight. I've been in worse rooms than this one with worse odds than this, Marcus said, not looking away from the display. Calm's not the same as confident. I'm not confident. I'm just no good to her if I sound like I'm not, so I don't sound like it. That's most of the job, honestly, whether you're pouring wine or talking somebody through a border crisis. Half of it's competence. The other half's just not letting the person relying on you hear you panic. You spoke of your old life only briefly tonight, Vosk said, after a moment. I would not press, given the circumstances. But I confess I am curious what a man capable of what I have witnessed tonight was doing pouring wine in a border house for 6 years, rather than commanding armies somewhere that valued the skill. Marcus was quiet for a moment, eyes still on the telemetry. Told a truth that cost 11 good soldiers' deaths to a colonel who didn't want to hear it, because the truth pointed at somebody with a powerful enough name that the truth got buried instead of the mistake. I got discharged for it. Learned the hard way that being right isn't the same as being useful if the people above you have already decided which one they'd rather have. He glanced up briefly. This job doesn't ask me to be right about anything except whether the wine's breathed long enough. Turns out that's a kind of peace I didn't know I needed until I found it. Vosk said nothing to that for a long moment, simply nodding slowly, something in his hard features softening by a fraction that would have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent the whole night watching him recalibrate. It worked the way Marcus's plans tended to work, not cleanly, not without a nerve-shredding margin, but it worked. Thren Cal's shuttle reached the primary relay tower with 11 minutes to spare on Vosk's own increasingly pessimistic estimate, and with Marcus talking her through the override interface via a comm link that crackled with interference for most of the flight. She pushed a direct, verified command authority override through the tower's hardline connection that superseded every order the rogue faction had issued in the preceding hour. The advancing units, receiving a direct, unmistakably authenticated stand-down order from their actual warlord, rather than the officers who had claimed to speak for him. Halted at the border exactly where they stood, confused but obedient to a chain of command that had, in the end, simply reasserted itself faster than the rebellion could consolidate. Vosk, watching the confirmation come through on Thren Cal's secondary comm relay, allowed himself something that looked almost like relief crossing features built for very little of it. "The border holds," he said. "The rebellion within my command structure will need to be dealt with, and dealt with thoroughly, but it will be dealt with as an internal matter rather than a war neither of our territories can afford tonight." "Good," Ussa said. "Then perhaps we can return to the conversation you actually came here to have, Warlord Vosk, on considerably more equal footing than you expected to find, I think." The negotiations that followed, once House Ithian's shattered dining hall had been cleared, and a smaller, quieter room prepared in its place, bore little resemblance to the ultimatum Vosk had arrived with hours earlier. Annexation was, by the small hours of the morning, no longer on the table at all. In its place stood a mutual defense accord, drafted with input from both households' senior staff, that recognized House Ithian's continued sovereignty in exchange for border cooperation. Neither side had been willing to seriously discuss before tonight's chaos forced the issue. Thren Cal, still faintly shaking from the flight but clearly proud of it, was reassigned on the spot to a standing liaison post between the two households, a gesture Vosk offered with the particular gravity of a man who understood exactly how much trust it represented. The talks ran long, well past what anyone had expected, both sides working through details that would have taken weeks through normal diplomatic channels, but somehow found resolution in a single exhausted night. Perhaps because everyone at that table had just watched the alternative play out in real time and had no appetite left for pretending the stakes were anything less than they were. Corvin, the old diplomat who'd spent the fight frozen at the table, proved unexpectedly sharp once the shock wore off, catching two clauses in the draft accord that would have quietly favored Vosk's territory over House Ithian's in a border dispute 5 years down the line. Adjustments Vosk accepted with only minor grumbling once they were pointed out. "Your advisor has a keen eye," Vosk observed at one point, watching Corvin mark up the draft with brisk, precise strokes. "He's had a lot of practice reading contracts written by people who assume nobody's paying close enough attention," Ussa said. "Tonight seems to have sharpened everyone's attention rather considerably." Marcus wasn't present for most of it, having finally allowed the physician to finish properly setting his ribs and stitching the gash along his thigh. But Ussa found him afterward, well past midnight, sitting alone in the pantry he'd been standing in when this whole evening started, checking a fresh set of glasses against the light out of the same old habit that apparently survived even a night like this one. "You could be resting," she said. "Could be. Figured somebody should make sure the good crystal survived the evening better than I did." He set a glass down, wincing as the movement pulled at his ribs. "How'd the rest of it go?" "Better than I had any right to expect, given how it started." She sat on the same overturned crate she'd occupied hours earlier, looking, for the first time all night, genuinely tired rather than merely composed. "Vosk asked about you again before he left. Wanted to know where House Ithian found a butler capable of dismantling an elite security detail with a dinner fork and a candelabra." "What'd you tell him?" "That you came with excellent references," Ussa said, and this time the almost smile from earlier in the evening became something closer to a real one. "He didn't believe me, but he had the good grace not to press the matter further. I think he's decided it's safer not to know." Smart man, warlord tendencies aside. Marcus picked up another glass, checking it against the light. "He's only a butler, you told him. Wasn't wrong exactly. just wasn't the whole story. No, Asa agreed. It very rarely is with you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the pantry quiet around them, the estate slowly settling back into something like its ordinary rhythm somewhere beyond the door. Thank you, Asa said eventually. For tonight. For 6 years of tonight, really, even the ones that didn't end in broken ribs. Just doing the job, Marcus said, and meant that too, mostly, even if both of them understood by now that the job had never really been just the job. My mother used to say something, Asa added, after a moment, that the measure of a household wasn't the silver or the wine or the guest list. It was whether the people serving it would still be standing there if everything else fell apart. I didn't fully understand what she meant until tonight. Your mother was right about most things, Marcus said. Wish I could tell her she called that one dead on. Word of what had happened in House Ithian's dining hall spread through Korathi diplomatic circles faster than either of them expected. And faster still once Thren Cal, settling into her new liaison post with evident enthusiasm, began quietly confirming the details to anyone who asked with sufficient discretion. Marcus found himself, in the weeks that followed, the subject of considerably more curious attention than he'd ever wanted or asked for, a state of affairs he handled the same way he handled most things, by continuing to polish silverware and pretending not to notice. You've become something of a legend, Asa told him one evening, several weeks later, watching him set the table for a considerably smaller and less politically fraught dinner than the last one had turned out to be. Half the border houses believe I employ a retired Special Forces operative disguised as household staff. The other half believe you're some manner of engineered bodyguard the previous Grand Duchess commissioned before her death. Both wrong, Marcus said, straightening a fork by a fraction of a centimeter. I'm just a man who got tired of being useful in ways that got people killed, and found a job where being useful mostly just means making sure the wine gets poured properly. Tonight was an aberration. I'd appreciate it staying that way, if it's all the same to you. I can't promise that, Asa said. Vosk's accord has made this house considerably more interesting to a great many people who previously never gave it a second thought. Some of them will not be as easily talked out of violence as a dinner fork, and a broken rib count managed tonight. Then I suppose I'd better make sure the silver stays sharp, Marcus said, and went back to setting the table, because whatever came next, the fork still needed to sit exactly 1 centimeter from the plate's edge, and that, at least, was a kind of order he still knew exactly how to hold on to. Thren Cal visited the following week, ostensibly on liaison business, and spent most of the visit trying, with limited success, to talk Marcus into teaching her the wristlock technique that had taken down the 4th retainer. He relented, eventually, mostly because she reminded him, in ways he didn't say out loud, of the kind of soldier he might have mentored once, a long time ago, before names in reports got people quietly discharged instead of promoted. You're a good teacher, she told him, after her 3rd failed attempt finally became a 4th successful one, twisting the training dummy's arm into a lock that made even Marcus nod in quiet approval. I had a good teacher myself once, Marcus said. Different life, different uniform. Same basic principle, though you learn the technique so you never have to use it in anger, and you use it in anger exactly as rarely as you can manage. Most nights the silverware's enough. Do you regret it? She asked, unexpectedly serious. Leaving that life behind, ending up here. Marcus considered the question longer than she probably expected him to. Some days, he admitted. Miss the certainty of it sometimes, knowing exactly what the mission was, exactly what success looked like. This job's messier than that. Harder to measure some weeks. but I get to watch the people I protect grow into who they're going to be, instead of just watching them survive one mission to the next. That's worth more than I expected it to be when I first took the job. Didn't figure that out until a few years in. Thren Cal seemed to turn that over for a while, setting the training dummy's arm gently back into place. Vosk's still furious about the rebellion, you know. 3 of the officers involved have already been removed from command. He mentioned, more than once, that he intends to consult you again the next time his engineering staff hits a wall they can't think their way around. Tell him I charge in dinner invitations, Marcus said, preferably ones that don't end with anyone's ribs getting broken this time. Autumn came to the Korathi capital eventually, the storm season finally breaking into long stretches of clear, cold weather, and House Ithian settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in 18 months, genuinely stable rather than merely holding together through sheer effort. USA's advisors had stopped, mostly, treating Marcus's presence in strategy discussions as an oddity and started simply expecting it. A shift Marcus noticed but never commented on, the same way he never commented on most changes that suited him fine as they were. He still polished the silver every evening before service, still set every fork exactly 1 centimeter from the plate's edge, still checked the crystal against the light out of habit rather than necessity. But he'd started, in the month since that dinner, allowing himself small deviations from the invisibility he'd spent 6 years perfecting. A direct answer here, an unguarded opinion there. The occasional evening spent teaching Thren Cal a new technique on the training dummy in the estate's lower courtyard, where the household staff had grown accustomed to the strange sight of their unassuming butler moving with a precision that had nothing to do with silverware at all. He's only a butler, Usa had told a warlord once, trying to keep him safe by making him small. It hadn't worked, not the way she'd intended, but Marcus had come to understand in the months since that she'd been right about one thing regardless. He was a butler, fully and without irony, and the rest of what he'd been before simply lived alongside that now quietly, the way old scars live alongside a life that's moved past needing them, ready if the silverware ever wasn't enough, and content, on every ordinary evening it was. If watching a butler dismantle an elite security detail with nothing but a serving tray and a dinner fork made your night, go ahead and hit that like button. Marcus Wren would tell you it's just good service. But we both know better. Subscribe if you want more of humanity's most unassuming heroes proving that "he's only a butler" is exactly the sentence you don't want to be saying when the shooting starts. And drop a comment telling me what you think Vosk's rogue officers try next. Share this one with Soam, anybody who still underestimates the quiet ones in the room.